Imagine it's June 23rd, 1991. You're a kid standing in a store and you've stopped dead in front of a display TV. There's a blue thing on the screen. Too fast to really track, tearing across a green hillside, scattering gold rings, moving quicker than anything you thought a video game could move. You don't have the words for it yet, but you're looking at a declaration of war. Sega has just built a hedgehog to take down a plumber. And now spin the calendar forward, 5 years to the day. June 23rd, 1996, and in Japan, that plumber answers. He steps out of 2 dimensions and into 3, on a brand new console that's about to rewrite what a video game can even be. 1 square on the calendar, 2 titans, and somehow that's only the opening shot, because June 23rd across the decades keeps turning up at the center of the gaming universe. We're talking about all this and more on This Week in Video Game History. Welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, Doug Coleman, and this week we're covering June 22nd through June 28th. And I'll be honest with you, this might be the most loaded date on the entire calendar. It's the week that gave us the birth of a blue blur built to dethrone a plumber, the shooter that dragged the whole industry into true 3D with a soundtrack by 9 Inch Nails, the day Mario himself stepped into the 3rd dimension and launched a console, one of the most beloved role-playing games ever made, a hedgehog's last goodbye on a dying console, and the Dark Knight's most infamous launch. Plus, 3 stories worth slowing down for. The day the Supreme Court decided video games are art, the era when ship it now, fix it later became the industry's default setting, and the 30-year war between 2 companies that started with a plumber and a hedgehog. So grab your controller and press start to continue. Here's everything that dropped during the week of June 22nd through the 28th across gaming history. 6 games. And I need you to notice something. 5 of them landed on the exact same date, June 23rd. 5 games, 5 different decades, 1 square on the calendar. So we've got precisely 1 game that breaks the pattern. We're going to start there on June 22nd and then spend the rest of our timeline on the single most crowded date in this entire show's history. Let's run it. On June 22nd, 1996, id or ID Software released the shareware version of Quake, and the ground shifted under the entire medium. Here's what you have to understand. Up to this point, even Doom, id's genre-defining monster, was faking it. The world looked 3D, but the monsters were flat cardboard cutouts, and you couldn't truly look up or down. Quake threw all of that out. Real 3D geometry, polygonal monsters you could circle, a world with actual verticality. It ran like a freight train and it looked like nothing else on Earth. And it made a whole lot of people go out and buy a computer just to play it. And the soundtrack? That dread-soaked industrial ambience crawling under everything was composed by Trent Reznor and 9 Inch Nails. And if you played it, you remember that the nail gun ammo boxes in the game are stamped with the NIN logo. A little love note buried in the carnage. But the part that mattered most wasn't single player at all. Quake is where online deathmatch was truly born, where players started dialing into servers to frag each other in real time, and where mod culture exploded because id handed players the tools to rebuild the game themselves. Half the multiplayer games you've played since trace a bloodline straight to this one day in June. I remember picking this game up when it first came out and was absolutely amazed about how it felt. The craziness, the pure fun, the nail gun. There are some games that the moment you pick it up, they feel special and feel immediately different, important even. This was one of those games that sticks out as a genre-defining moment, and you knew it the moment it started. And now we arrive at June 23rd. buckle up, we're going to be here for a while. On June 23rd, 1991, Sega released Sonic the Hedgehog in North America. And it wasn't just a game, it was a weapon. Nintendo owned the living room. Mario was the most famous character on the planet. So Sega built a mascot to do the one thing Mario couldn't: go fast. Blistering, white knuckle, can't quite keep up fast. All loops and springs and momentum, with a soundtrack that absolutely cooked. Sega bundled it with the Genesis, and it worked exactly as intended. It sold somewhere around 15 million copies, and it made Sega genuinely cool in a way that, for a few short years, actually had Nintendo on the back foot. This is the shot that started a war, and we're going to come back to that war later in the show. And I have to admit, I never really got into Sonic much. I was raised on Nintendo, so the thought of playing anything Sega felt foreign to me. All my heroes back then taught me that loyalty was the most important thing. But in high school, I received a Sega Genesis. The moment I picked up Sonic, I was hooked. The speed, the music, the graphics. I sucked at it, but man, was it fun. For now, just hold on to this date, June 23rd, 1991. Remember it, because 5 years later to the day, the plumber is going to answer back. 5 years to the day. On June 23rd, 1996 in Japan, Nintendo launched the Nintendo 64. And sitting in the box was Super Mario 64. And this one's a genuine before and after line in the history of the medium. A region note, this is the Japanese launch date. North America got it in September, but June 23rd is where it begins. Because nobody had really solved 3D yet. Moving a character freely through a three-dimensional space felt clumsy and wrong on every system that had tried it. Super Mario 64 walked in and made it feel effortless. That was largely down to two things shipping with the console: an analog stick that made you move Mario with actual nuance, a slow tiptoe, a full sprint, anything in between, and a camera system, literally a little cameraman following you around, solving a problem most players didn't even know existed yet. Every 3D platformer that came after stood on this game's shoulders. It is quietly one of the most influential pieces of software ever written, and the fact that it shares its release date with Sonic, the very mascot built to kill Mario, exactly 5 years apart, that's not a coincidence the universe owed us, but we'll take it. Same date, new decade, June 23rd, 2000. This is the day Iron Storm released Deus Ex, the game that, for a solid stretch, topped basically every greatest PC game of all time list ever published. And it earned it. The pitch was radical. What if the game just let you decide? You're J.C. Denton, a cybernetically augmented agent dropped into a tangle of near-future conspiracy, and almost every problem the game hands you has 3 or 4 valid solutions. There's a locked door. You can find the key, you can hack the panel, and you can stack crates and climb through a window. You can blow the wall open. You can sweet talk the guy who has the key code. The game didn't funnel you. It trusted you. And it quietly reshaped itself around the choices you made. That philosophy, player freedom as the entire point, is what we now call the immersive sim. And the designer, Warren Spector, basically wrote its Bible here. You can draw a straight line from this game to Dishonored, to Prey, to half the prestige games of the last 15 years. June 23rd, 2000. The day a game decided to get out of your way. And exactly 10 years after the Hedgehog declared war, June 23rd comes back around for the saddest, most fitting entry on this list. On June 23rd, 2001, Sonic Adventure 2 launched on the Sega Dreamcast. And a region note, because this one matters to the story. North America actually got it a few days earlier, but Sega deliberately set the Japanese and European release for June 23rd to land on the 10th anniversary of Sonic's original launch. They knew exactly what date they were choosing. It's a great game. The fast, polished city escape blasting peak of 3D Sonic, the debut of Shadow the Hedgehog, the hero and dark storylines, but it's haunted by its timing because the Dreamcast was already dead. Sega had announced it was getting out of the hardware business entirely. This beautiful, ambitious console, the one Sega bet the whole company on, was being switched off. And Sonic Adventure 2 was the last Sonic game it would ever get. So sit with that for a second. The Hedgehog was born to fight the console wars, takes his final bow on a Sega console on his own 10th birthday as Sega walks away from the fight for good. We are absolutely coming back to that. One more June 23rd. Our most recent one, June 23rd, 2015. That's the day Rocksteady released Batman Arkham Knight, the grand finale of the Arkham trilogy, the run of games that finally, after decades of mediocre licensed Batman cash-ins, made you genuinely feel like Batman. This one handed you the keys to the Batmobile and turned all of Gotham into your playground. And on consoles, it was a triumph. On PC, it was a catastrophe. The port was so broken, stuttering, crashing, the frame rate chained to the floor, that 2 days after the release, the publisher did something almost nobody ever does. They pulled it off sale completely. You could not buy Batman. And that's not just a funny footnote. It's a doorway into one of the most defining problems of modern gaming. The era where launch day became a beta test. Hold that thought, though, because it's one of our deep dives later today. I told you to hold that thought about Batman. Here it is. When Warner Brothers pulled Arkham Knight off sale in June 2015, it was shocking, but it was also a symptom. We had quietly slid into an era where the version of a blockbuster you bought on day one was, more and more, an unfinished one. A beta test you paid $60 to run. Studios figured out they could ship a game in rough shape and patch it later, because the disc really wasn't the final product anymore. The internet was. The game would be fixed eventually. Maybe. Arkham Knight was an early, loud example, but it kept happening. It kept getting bigger and bigger. Until December 2020, when CD Projekt Red released Cyberpunk 2077, one of the most anticipated games ever made, in such a broken state on older consoles that Sony did the almost unthinkable. It pulled Cyberpunk from the PlayStation Store and handed refunds to anyone who wanted out. The exact same move Warner had made with Batman 5 years later on a much bigger stage. How ship it now, fix it later became the industry's default setting, and what it cost the people who pre-order on faith, that's another story worth slowing down for another time. If the broken launch era is the medium at its most cynical, our next story is the medium at its most vindicated. And it happened just 4 years before that broken Batman. We wind to June 27th, 2011. For 3 decades, video games had basically been on trial, blamed for violence, hauled through congressional hearings, legislated against. California had gone the furthest. It passed a law making it a crime to sell a violent video game to a minor, treating games as something uniquely dangerous. And on June 27th, 2011, the Supreme Court of the United States said no. In a 7-2 decision, the court struck the law down, and Justice Anton Scalia writing for the majority, put it about as plainly as it gets. Games tell stories through characters and dialogue and plot, just like books and plays and films that came before them, so they get the same protection. The First Amendment. Full stop. That was the moment the highest court in the country looked at this medium we love and settled it. This is speech. This is art. And it is protected. The whole long, strange road to that courtroom, the moral panics, the crusading lawyers, the hearings, is an episode all on its own. 3 separate times today, June 23rd has shown us the same 2 companies. So let's finally talk about the war that ties them together. In the late 1980s, this wasn't a war. It was an occupation. Nintendo owned the home console business so completely that Nintendo was just the word people used for video games. And then Sega decided to fight. Their whole pitch was everything Nintendo wasn't. Faster, louder, cooler, a little bit dangerous. Quote, Genesis does what Nintendo don't, end quote. And on June 23rd, 1991, they handed that attitude a mascot. Sonic. And for the first time, Nintendo had to look over its shoulder. For a few years in the early 90s, Sega was genuinely winning. And then it all came apart. A string of botched hardware, baffling add-ons, and self-inflicted wounds bled away every bit of that lead. And by the time the Dreamcast showed up, a genuinely brilliant machine, it was already too late. Which is exactly why Sonic Adventure 2 on June 23rd, 2001 hits the way it does. The Hedgehog built to win the war, taking his final bow on a Sega console 10 years to the day after he started it, as Sega quietly walked away from the hardware business for good. How Sega went from Nintendo to surrendering the whole fight, the blast processing, the bungled launches, the decisions that may have cost them everything. That's a war that deserves its own full campaign. And we'll fight it another day. Imagine it's June 23rd, 1991. A kid is standing in a store watching a blue blur tear across the screen, and somewhere in the back of his head, a thought forms that he doesn't have the words for yet. Games can do this now. He has no idea that the exact same square on the calendar is going to keep doing this. That 5 years on, to this day, a plumber... Let's rewind. That 5 years on, to the day, a plumber will step into 3 dimensions and change everything. That a man named J.C. Denton will teach an entire genre to get out of your way. That the very hedgehog he's watching right now will take his final bow on the same date 10 years later as the company that made him walks away from the fight. He just knows that this blue thing is fast and that something feels different. That's the thing about this week. One date, June 23rd, and the whole shape of the medium keeps pouring through it. A war between 2 companies. A console that solved the 3rd dimension. A courtroom where 9 justices decided that, yes, this is art. And a broken Batman that reminded us that people who still make these games are still, after all this time, figuring it out as they go. The games change. The hardware dies. The companies rise and fall and sometimes surrender. But that kid in front of the screen, the one who just felt the floor shift under him, he never really goes away. They are the reason any of us are still here. Still paying attention. Still hitting start. That's it for this episode. Thank you all so much for sticking around. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe over on YouTube or follow the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps. Artwork for the show is done by Ms. Tink. Music is produced by Shane Mandini. Go follow him on Twitch and Spotify and listen to all his great work. The show is written, produced, and hosted by me, Doug Coleman. Be sure to save your game, nerds. I'll see you next week.